So welcome all of you again, and sorry for this little bit technical glitch on our end, and but that should not deter you from not listening to this wonderful presentation that we are looking forward to. I told you briefly about Dr. Junaid Shaikh, who is from Pune, born and brought up in Pune, and he had his his doctoral degree from University of Washington in Seattle. And recently his very, I would say, path-breaking book has been published. Originally it was published in the United States, and now the Indian edition of that book is available. The book is titled as Outcast Bombay, and um, this book is not just about the urban planning or how the cities grow. It's about the social movements, how they shape the lives of millions of people. It's about the Ambedkarite movement up there, the heroes of the Ambedkarite movement, the kind of movements that emerged from the cities like Bombay, the Dalit Panther movement, the Marxist movement. It has wonderful take on Annabhau Sathe's role in shaping up the workers' movement in the city of Bombay. And I think what Junaid did with this book is to really exhume a lot of things that have taken place in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even prior to that, and try to create the city of Bombay as seen from the eyes of the workers, from the Dalits, and so on and so forth. Though he's a professor of history in the University of California, Santa Cruz, but his approach is not mere historical approach, as he has brought his studies of different disciplines together, and he has created a book that is replete with interdisciplinary ideas, themes, and whatnot. So very welcome again, Junaid Bhai, and I would request you to please talk about your wonderful book, and we will follow it up with the discussion. And before I ask you, request you to talk about your book. Hearty congratulations for producing such a work of intellectual. It's an intellectual feat that has been accomplished. So welcome, brother.
Thank you so much, Mangesh, for such a warm introduction and for inviting me. Good evening to everybody, Jai Bhim, and good morning from California. The point of the book was precisely that, actually, that in order to understand the movement and various movements, the Dalit movement, Marxist movement, the politics of the poor, you also have to engage with the making of the city itself, which would mean that you also engage with political economy, which is industrial capitalism, for instance, the work of urban planners, right? So all this is in conversation. So political economy, urban planning is in conversation with movements, how movements engage with it, critique it. And that was actually the point of the book. Let me go back and tell you how I've constructed the book. So what are some of the important questions? And then I'll like to talk a little bit more about Marxism and how Marxism and caste intertwined in the 1920s and 1930s and 40s. So it will also be about how the Ambedkarite movement looked at Marxism in that period. But it's also how Marxism, when it came to India, and when Marxists started looking at India and thinking of an Indian revolution in order to transform India, how they saw India, how they saw caste, right? Because they had to see caste because it's a revolution in Indian society. So they had to say something about caste. So a lot of the presentation will be about that. Let me share screen and let me begin. Let me just go to the slideshow and start. So the central question of the book, right? I mean, books, papers, books, they all have central questions. The central question of the book is, what is the history of caste in Bombay city? And the thesis of the book, the main argument of the book is, in Bombay, industrial capitalism, it attaches itself to caste. And makes caste a part of its metabolic system. So what I mean is that if you, in Bombay in the 19th century, if you were to start an industry, you need capital, you need money. Now, there are no nationalized banks like they were in post-colonial India. There were no nationalized banks in the 19th century. So how would capitalists raise money? It's through their caste and kinship network. So in order to start an industry, you needed caste and kinship network. And most of the people who started industries had made their money in the opium trade. Then after you've started an industry, you need labor to work in the industry. And if you need 1,000 workers, you want to make sure that 5,000 or 10,000 workers turn up at the factory gate, so that then you can drive down the wages, right? Pay them less. So in order to recruit those workers, get those 10,000 workers in the city, for instance, as an example, again, capitalists relied on caste and kinship network. A mukaddam or a jobber would go often to towns and countryside and recruit workers from the caste and kinship network. Now the workers have come to the city and they are being paid less. They are agitating. You need to discipline the workers. Again, there the jobber played an important role. Right? And then the workers also have to live in the city. So where do they live? Right? In housing, in slums, in tenements, in chawls, etc. They also need credit at various moments, which again was the work of the jobber and other people. So in order to reproduce a labor force too, you needed caste. Right? So caste was very important for industrial capitalism in the city. That's the main argument of the book. But as we know that despite, as I'm arguing, caste was important, as we know, there were not many studies of caste in the city. Caste is seen mostly as a rural phenomenon. Even by people like M.N. Srinivas and many other sociologists, there were works, few works here and there who talk about caste in the city, but by and large, for the most part in the 20th century, caste was, and even now, many people see it as a rural phenomenon. As I'm saying, things are changing, right? So why aren't people seeing caste in a city? Why are they saying that there is not enough material to study caste in a city? Right? One argument that I make is that caste is hiding in plain sight. Right? It's there for all to see, but nobody is seeing it. So where is it there for all to see? I studied two sides, which is the built environment, and built environment would include things like housing, etc. But not just housing, of course. Built environment would include the sewage system, the other buildings, bridges, all that shapes in the built environment. So that built environment is one side, and language is the other side that I study. Right? And I build this argument, and I explain this argument in 5 chapters of the book. And these are, let me just give you a sense of the 5 chapters. So as I'm saying, if you're getting workers in the city, and many of the low-paying workers were Dalit workers, of course. So if there are workers coming to the city, where are they staying? I mean, the question is housing, and housing becomes an important thing. Where would you house them? So how the caste question played into housing was one chapter, in which I also include things like the Bombay Improvement Trust and the Bombay Development and Department chawls that came up. And those chawls were looking at caste in order to house workers, and many Dalits, of course, were living in particular chawls in these Bombay Improvement Trust chawls. Right? So, and that becomes an important site first for the Ambedkarite movement, and later on then for other movements, including the Dalit Panther movement in the 70s. The second chapter is talking about Marxism and language, and I'll talk a little bit more substantially when I get into the presentation. So I won't give you an idea now. The third chapter, now I'm talking about the built environment, I'm talking about housing, I'm talking about slums. Urban planning becomes an important way to address some of these questions. Right? And so the chapter is third chapter. So urban planning is a theme throughout. Right? What do urban planners say? And the urban planners from the very beginning, from the 20th century, that is, are saying that, we should cut down on the industries, get rid of the slums. If you cut down on the industries in the city itself, and limit the industry in the city, first in the beginning of the 20th century, but later on they would say, decentralize, that is, move industries away too from Bombay. You will automatically reduce the number of workers, which means you'll automatically reduce overcrowding, which means you'll automatically reduce slums too. And then by the 1940s and 50s, they had provisions for demolishing slums, etc. So urban planning is an important site. But it's in some of these sites of these tenements that I was talking about, of the slums that come up, of Matunga Labor Camp, etc., these places, that you see the emergence of not just of the Dalit movement, but also of then Dalit literature. Right? Many writers have who have become icons in Dalit literature grew up in these slums, like Dasal, for instance, and Pagul, etc. What they describe, what they write about is life in the slums. That is an important part. But literature in itself is its own field. Right? There are relationships of power everywhere. Even in literature, there are relationships of power. One relationship of power, of course, is how would you get Dalit literature recognized? Right? You want recognition for Dalit literature. Who will recognize this Dalit literature? It will be the established literature, the literati. Right? Then once you are establishing it, then the question is then who will patronize it? Who will give it awards? It will be the Maharashtra government, for instance. Right? That is the field of power. Right? And then who will get the awards? Right? Who will get the awards is also mostly male writers. So these are some of the things that I've spoken about in these different chapters. So housing, slums, all these, these themes continue throughout these chapters. Let me come now to then, once you have this formation, in which, as I'm saying, access to a job and is dependent on caste and kinship networks. And then Dalits, when they are trying to find housing, they are not allowed to rent in many tenements. And they are underpaid, so they start living in slums. Right? So something like this, for instance, this is from A.R. Bernard Hurst's book, Labor and Housing in Bombay. So you see the tenements in the background, and then you see these hutments here. And Bernard Hurst identified that these are the places in which some of the Dalits lived. Right? And this is from the 1920s. So when you are seeing this formation, if let's say you are from the Marxist movement or from the Dalit movement, and you're seeing this formation, this urban formation in which capitalism is mixing with caste, in which housing and life in slums is precarious, how do you then understand it, and how do you then try to transform it? So various movements, various activists, writers address this question throughout the 20th century, and there is a lot to learn from this 20th century. But one thing they all did was they all spoke about revolution. Right? At various moments, at various moments they're talking about a revolution to transform this social formation, urban formation, to find an alternative to this. Right? So revolution then would mean that, and I can explain later if you have questions, revolution would mean that you disrupt some existing practice and then produce a rupture which will bring about something new. Right? So there is a yearning to go beyond the social and political constraints of the present. Right? So for instance, for Ambedkar, the revolution, the annihilation of caste was a revolution to transform Indian society. For Marxists, there would be a political revolution led by the workers, which will lead to socialism. First, it would mean the capture of the state. And then, of course, that would lead to then a communist society. Right? And the state won't be important. That is the Marxist line. For urban planners, and urban planners are also invoking the same word, revolution. They use that word revolution frequently or often in the 20th century. It meant you transform the city itself, the spatial organization of the city, through their plans. and make it conducive for the circulation of capital mostly. And even Dalit writers and the Dalit Panthers are invoking revolution because for the Dalit writers, they're creating a new field of literature called Dalit Sahitya. Right? And so Dalit Sahitya, the goal is to negate the existing cultural hierarchies of what is existing Marathi literature. Right? They're creating a new field of literature. They're saying, those aesthetics of that is not important. I mean, we don't agree with it. We are creating this new field of literature. So it's a negation of this cultural hierarchy and a negation of the social hierarchy, which is what the Dalit Panthers wanted. Right? So at different times in the 20th century, many people invoke this notion of revolution. These revolutions, of course, as with most revolutions, they never achieve their objectives, or they don't achieve their objectives. But they still, because of the energy that has been put in, the thoughts that have been put in, the ideas that have been put into it, right, they capture the imagination even of future generations. So that's why I'm saying revolutions and the dreams of revolution are very infectious. So when writers in the 60s and 70s are creating a field of literature called Dalit Sahitya, they are, because they see it as a revolutionary move. They are not just laying claim to the Ambedkar revolution, but they're also saying that our lineage comes from the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. Right? So again, the idea of revolution, of course, all that is very important, but how does that idea play out in practice is the other question. Right? For ideas, I mean, these are all wonderful ideas, but what happens with it in practice? And that I'll highlight now through the question of Marxism, through how the Marxist revolution was imagined in the 20th century, in the 1920s and 1930s particularly, and the 1940s. So if you're a Marxist in the 20th century, you have to address the question of capitalism, of course. But because this Marxist revolution is also going to lead to a social revolution, you also have to then talk about caste in some way, right? Even if you try and then elide it or avoid it, but at least in some way you have to say something about this, about caste, right? Because you're bringing about a revolution in Indian society, as I had mentioned earlier. Right? So capitalism would be overcome by a political revolution. But will the social revolution follow it? Will the social revolution accompany it? Will the social revolution then annihilate caste or upend caste relationships? That is the question. So in order to, of course, think of revolution, Marxists, of course, you have to read, Marxists of the 1920s and 30s were trying to read as much Marxism that they can lay their hands on, Marxist pamphlet, Marxist literature. But what were they laying their hands on, right? So if you see the list that you, from the archives, from the Maharashtra State Archive, and if you go to some of these files on Bolshevism, you'll see a list of books that the CID has confiscated. Right? And these books included writings mostly from Germany and the United States and Britain. Right? So the books that were there at that time were, that they have, this is a sample, of course. Some of the sampling of the books is M. N. Roy's India in Transition, Daniel De Leon's Socialism versus Anarchism, Principles of Industrial Unionism. So there are these books, and Engels' Historical Materialism. Nothing much from Karl Marx, really, right? Because this is the time when there is a surveillance system. There are not too many books that are coming in, and the books that are coming in, which we can get a glimpse of from the books that the government has confiscated, are some of these books that are coming in. Right? So there is one books that are coming in through this node, which is through post offices, or people are bringing some books. One important person who is important in the early history of Marxism in Bombay city is a merchant and a landlord called Ranchhod Das Lotwala. An interesting character because he's supporting Marxism, of course, but he's also financing the Arya Samaj. He's also supporting the Arya Samaj. I'll stick here to his Marxism. He's the managing editor of director of Hindustan Limited, and has started publishing Hindustan. And he has read Dange, Shripad Amrit Dange's Gandhi versus Leninism, which was published in 1921. So he read it and was very impressed with Dange. And then he calls Dange, befriends Dange. And Dange starts reads the Communist Manifesto for the first time in his library, in this Ranchhod Lotwala's library. And Lotwala has collected some of this material on his trips to Europe. And then the press that he finances, that is Lotwala, publishes some of the English editions of the Communist Manifesto, Wage, Labor and Capital. R.P. Dutt or Rajnipam Dutt is an important figure of in British communism and Indian communism. So Dutt's communism, then Kautsky's Working Class. So these are some of the books that are published by the Hindustan press, all in English at this moment, right? The Marathi translations, Marathi publications start much later. Right? So he also starts a trust for the propagation of socialism. What he does is he sets aside rent from his property, one of his properties. And he says, okay, this is a 4-story building. Whatever rent we'll get from that 4-story building, which includes shops and housing, some housing tenements, that rent is for the propagation of socialism. Right? And Dange says that without him, leftist radicalism wouldn't have taken root in Bombay city. Dange later on starts the English Weekly Socialist, and there are 3 volumes of his writing from the Socialist, which you'll find in the library system, edited by his daughter Rosa Deshpande and other people too. There in the Socialist, he gets a group of young people who identify themselves as socialists, like Ghate, Deshpande, Mirajkar, Joshi, and they become some of the founding members of the Communist Party of India in 1925. Dange is not, because Dange has been arrested in the Kanpur conspiracy case in 1924. So the communist universe in the city, of course, includes people like this Dange, includes landlords, the landlord like Ranchhod Lotwala or Ghate Mirajkar. But then there is an important strand of communists. There are people like this Babu Karim, who studied in Urdu and Marathi till the 4th grade and worked as a hotel boy in the 1910s. But in 1920, he gets a job as a Lascar or a seaman on the ship called SS Tarantia. And then that work takes him to many ports around the world. And that's where he attends meetings of socialists, of communists in these places. So he's going to London and Liverpool and Glasgow, and he's attending meetings there. Right? He's collecting literature, communist literature, and then he's bringing it back to Bombay and distributing it among his friends. Right? And he's reading that with the help of his friends. So now, if you're reading Marxism in the 1920s and 30s, and you're reading Marxism in the context of India in the 1920s and 30s, you know that now this is the colonial period. You know this is how industrial capitalism in Bombay city is working. You know some of the agrarian conditions in India at this time. You want to transform that by borrowing ideas from Marxism. Right? So this borrowing and then the attempt to transform India through some of those ideas that you've borrowed and making sense of those ideas, that is, which means it is translation of Marxian conceptual categories into Indian languages, and also of sociology to shed light on Indian society. So because Marxism was caste was an important feature of social hierarchy, Marxists have to say something about caste. right? Even if to say no, the caste is redundant, which is what many people end up saying in the 20th century, that caste is getting redundant, more and more redundant, because modernity is making it more and more redundant, right? So their main assumption, and it's a stated assumption, they've said it openly, is that capitalism would desiccate or weaken caste affinities, right? And this people with weakened caste affinities will then mobilize them as workers, and whatever little caste that is remaining, that affinity, will be negated in the process of a socialist revolution, and will be addressed by social reformers. So Indian social reformers will also address this question, and in this process of socialism, in any case, everything will disappear. So that's why caste will disappear. That's their stated assumption. So for instance, Roy believed that caste is no longer a living factor. Roy, very influential Marxist at this time, is saying caste is not a living social factor. That is saying caste will be overcome by the advance of modern industry and political democracy. But this theory, interesting theory, is out of sync with practice. Because I'm saying in Bombay, as I'd argued earlier, the thesis of the book is that capitalism has attached itself to caste and is relying on caste to sustain itself. So how is capitalism then weakening caste? So Dange was an important intellectual of the Marxist movement of this time. And he tries to address the caste question from the vantage point of its end. Now, the end, as we know, is that when there is a revolution, socialist revolution, caste will also end. Right? That's the stated assumption. So from that vantage point, how do you explain the beginning? So from very early on, from 1922, 1923, he's addressing some of these questions, and he's saying that by combining history and mythology, he's saying that earlier there was an Aryan commune in Indian antiquity. That Aryan commune then later on devolves into Indian feudalism. That feudalism will be overcome with capitalism, and that capitalism will be overcome with communism. Right? So this that's his way. That's his mode of production. That analysis, the changing mode of production, which he's tried to apply to India. But in that, the beginning is the Aryan commune, a virtual paradise, and he has many wonderful things to say about the Aryan commune. Where does he get this idea of the Aryan commune from? Where does he locate it? Dange is an admirer of Tilak. Right? If anything, he is an admirer. If most importantly, he's an admirer of Tilak rather than, I would argue, even Marx or somebody. So in his Arctic home in the Vedas, Tilak had argued that the Vedic period of Indian antiquity starts in 4500 BC. And Dange is borrowing that directly, and he's locating the Aryan period in India in 4000 and 6000 BC. Historians have, don't agree with this at all. If you've read books on ancient India, this period seems is all out of sync, all wonky. Right? But that's Dange's point, that it is in there is an Aryan community at that time, and that over a period of time, then there is devolves into a division of labor. That gives rise to division of labor, which is then solidified into caste. So caste really is division of labor, right? And that caste, which is will be then overcome again, like M.N. Roy and like R.P. Dutt. But he is making a point that modernity will take care of caste, which includes capitalist modernity and socialist modernity. Dange identifies, he claims that he is economically deterministic, and he reads his sources in that way. And what are his sources? His sources are, as I'm saying, mythology, epics, Vedas. So for instance, he's saying, quoting the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita if you can see the quote, I'll just read the quote or a substantial part of the quote. The Gita lends directly its support to Marxian explanation of history, to the theory of economic determinism. When Gita records the testimony of the Lord Krishna that he had created the 4 divisions on the basis of guna and karma, he means nothing else than that divisions were an economic necessity of production. Caste had come into an existence to satisfy the economic needs of the society at that time. Right? So you get a glimpse of how Dange is reading his sources too, right? And what sources he's saying when he's talking about Indian antiquity. Of course, Dange, as you can see, has ignored an important lineage of caste thinking, anti-caste thinking by radical intellectuals like Jyotirao Phule and B.R. Ambedkar. When Phule in the 19th century had said that the caste system was the invention of Brahmins, and the Brahmins were descendants of Aryan invaders, obviously he's not looked at it. He doesn't think it's significant, which is why he's absolutely ignoring this lineage of thinking. And the Aryan invaders imposed their religion and composed books justifying caste. Similarly, Ambedkar in 1970s in caste in India had critiqued the functional view of caste as mere division of labor. Right? He had identified the important role of Brahmins in justifying and perpetuating the system. And because of the prestige accorded to Brahmins, then the castes beneath the Brahmins are also then imbibing and replicating the same logic. And that is how caste became robust and insidious, according to Ambedkar. So Dange's refusal to consider this lineage, because he's thinking that now caste is ending, right? I mean, now modernity has come, capitalism is weakening caste, socialism will get rid of it. So then if the non-Brahmin movement is saying something or is critiquing Brahmins, and then later on the Dalit movement are critiquing caste, Brahmins, etc. So for the non-Brahmin is saying they are unpatriotic and narrow vision. And this is one of the arguments, which is that because of the support to British colonialism. Right? He brands mostly the caste movements, both the anti-Brahmin movement and the Dalit movement, as movement really of the petty bourgeois, who really want a share in the spoils of colonialism. They want just a job, and then they will be happy. That's what they are saying. That's what Dange's critique is. Right? So he blamed this caste movement for not accepting the universality of class in his words. Right? These tensions continued even into jail. So when communists in India were, and particularly many from Bombay, 18 from Bombay, they land up in the Meerut jail in 1929 and 1933, and then there is a trial of the Meerut prisoners. There are many tensions within them. And one of the tensions, of course, is some caste tensions, because Arjun Alve and Govind Kasle, who were also part of the anti-Brahmin movement and the communist movement, the communists are blaming them for fostering strong anti-Brahmin feeling among workers. And Kasle are calling them communist Brahmins. Right? So there is a slanging match that is going on there. So then with the Pune Pact, etc., with the Dalit movement, with Ambedkar's rise in the Dalit movement, they are calling them, these Meerut prisoners are calling them artificial and ultimately reactionary. When these prisoners, when Bombay communists are in jail, one of the interesting things that happens is that they start translating whatever pamphlets that they can find. The process of translating these pamphlets into Marathi begins. The first Bengali translation of the Communist Manifesto is in 1926, but the Marathi translation is in 1931. And then there are two publishing houses called Kamgar Wangmay Prasarak Mandal and the Marxist Wangmay Pracharak Mandal. They are aligned to different factions of the communists. By many accounts, there are 3 and even 4 factions among Bombay communists at this time. So they translate some of these pamphlets, which included the Communist Manifesto, Wage, Labor and Capital, and then trade union movement in the colonies. So how do they translate? And this is also one important argument of this chapter of the book too, which is when they're translating abstract and conceptual categories. Now, Marx has created conceptual categories like value, like use value. So when they're translating these categories, these abstract conceptual categories, they're using Sanskrit or Sanskritized Marathi to translate these categories. Labor power is Shram Shakti, etc. But when they're translating the category which is referring to persons, like lumpen proletariat, for instance, which they also call slum proletariat. They're calling them Mawali or slum proletariat. And the term Negro, for instance, from wage labor and capital, they're translating as Siddhi Gulam. Right? So even in the translation of these terms, the argument that I've made is that you see that there is a mind-body dyad, which means that the abstract ones are in Sanskrit or Sanskritized Marathi, while the embodied ones, the bodily categories, lumpen proletariat, etc., are in slang. Right? So there is that's one example of the prevalence of hierarchy, call it caste, also, but in the language of the translation itself. Ambedkar in the 1920s had reservations about the communist movement. Right? In the weekly Samata, there is an anonymous article. I don't know who has written this, maybe Ambedkar himself. But in this anonymous article in 1928, if people will remember, and for those who don't know, there are important strikes, textile mill strikes in Bombay in 1928 and 1929. Right? Ambedkar supported the strikes in 1928, but supported after he gets certain promises from the communists of that time. But there are some reservations because in this weekly, in this editorial, you see that the critique is that communism could uproot Tsarism in Russia, but Brahminism will survive its onslaught in India. The tree of Brahminism will remain intact. Indian communists have little knowledge of the strength of Brahminism. Their heads are in Russia while their bodies live in India. And when communists, it says, are produced in the untouchable and backward castes, only then will communism in India be self-reflexive. That's the point, but that's the article that I'm citing from the Samta. As we know, of course, there are many communists from the Dalit communities in Bombay and also the lower caste groups in Bombay. One of them, of course, is R.B. More, who now we are beginning to know more and more about. Right? R.B. More embraced, he was in Bombay, he's listening to some of the speeches of the workers, he's curious about what is about Marxism, because he's listening to some of the leaders of the workers, he's curious. And in order to try and address his curiosity, he then also starts reading some of the Marxist pamphlets. He organizes reading groups in Bombay chawls. And he is part of both the communist and the Dalit movement. He's part of the communist movement, of course, but he does not end his ties with the Dalit movement. In fact, far from it. He believes that there should be a communist revolution, but also believes that there should be an independent Dalit movement. This I'm talking about R.B. More, and this again I'm talking about the 1930s here. He tried to forge a link between these two movements, and that did not work out as he had imagined. Right? And it's an ideological link that he tries to forge between the two movements. So to address tensions between the category of the working class, which can be a universal category, but also within that, how does the experience of being Dalit, how can you address that through this category of working class? Right? If you've faced, if you have not found housing in the city, or you have not found well-paying jobs in the textile mills or other industries in Bombay, how do you are denied access to education, etc. How do you address that tension within the category of the working class or the urban poor broadly? Can you address it within that? That is the question. And More obviously thought that you could, right? You have to then people have to think about it concretely. There was another Dalit from what is now Telangana. He comes from Secunderabad, called P. Palan, who had come and he started working in Bombay. He would come from there and started working in Bombay, and then went to the Soviet Union and studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. And then after spending almost a year and a half, 2 years in the Soviet Union, he comes back to Bombay. But then he's arrested and is sent to jail, and he contracts TB there and then dies there. Right? So there are these figures who are Dalit and communists in the 1920s, 1930s, even later on, of course. So Ambedkar, when he starts the Independent Labour Party, and which is inspired by the British Labour Party, he is using both labor to solicit support for the working, for his Labour Party. He's using the category labor, but both industrial and agricultural labor. But he is expressly stating in his 1938 speech that both capitalism and Brahminism are the enemies of the workers. Because caste is privileging some workers. Only some workers have better paying jobs. And they are invariably from the dominant caste groups, but disadvantaged many others. So he's saying that both capitalism and caste should be gotten rid of. Right? That's the point that Ambedkar is making in this moment in the 1930s, the late 1930s. But this moment, of course, passes that after the elections, the provincial governments are suspended after World War II starts in 1939. And the ideological reservations that Ambedkar has about communists and communists have about Ambedkar, they persist into the 1940s and 1950s. They often forged alliances, the Dalit movement and the communist movement in the 1920s, but those are for events. So if there is a strike, they would come together, and for that 1-day strike, 2-day strike, they would come, Dange and Ambedkar would come together on a platform and address the workers. So there is that too. There is tension, but then there is also evidence of collaboration. Sometimes in elections, they supported each other, but not in the 1952 elections. In the 1952 elections, the communists did not support Ambedkar, and that created a major distrust among the communists and the Ambedkarite movement. And which you can see evidenced by after Ambedkar's death, there is there is a rift between the Marxists, the communists, and the Dalit movement. And yet, of course, there are also people like Babbarao Bagul and the other icons of Dalit literature, Dasal. These people are interacting with communists. Bagul, for instance, says that he has grown up listening to the communists, the socialists who work in the Congress party. He's heard speeches of the Dalit movement. So he's part of all this. He's listened to all this, right? He's open to many of the arguments of the communists and the socialists, for instance, and of course, the Dalit movement too, right? And then for these writers, then the figure of the Mawali, as I was saying, it's also translated as slum proletariat. Mawali, slum proletariat, and the slum itself become important in their writings. Right? So let me conclude. What I'm saying is that if you want to understand Indian Marxism, as the point that I was trying to make with even the book, that if you want to understand Indian Marxism, then you'll also have to address the caste question too, or you'll encounter how they have tried to deal with the caste question first. Right? For them, caste will become redundant, is redundant already, and will become redundant soon. Right? Because firstly, capitalism will deal with caste, and then socialism will end it. But for the Dalit movement, capitalism and Brahminism were the twin axes of capitalism, and caste were the twin axes of oppression, and they have to be dealt with simultaneously. The communists believe that their path to an Indian revolution, well, because of that, they are circumspect about caste politics. Ambedkar's understanding of the durability and insidiousness of Brahminism made him suspicious about the efficacy of a class revolution. And yet there are people like More, of course, who are, believe in the socialist revolution, which will establish a communist society. But More also believes that there should be a commitment to the annihilation of caste. And he also believes that there is a validity for an independent Dalit movement. So annihilation of caste and emancipation of labor should take place, according to R.B. More. So this is the broader implication of the book, of my argument, is that we'll need to pay attention to how Marxism gets translated in particular places. Right. And in that translation, or in that vernacularization of Marxism itself, you'll see that there is an encounter with casteism, and they have to then come face to face with the anti-Brahmin and the Dalit movement, who are also mobilizing some of the same people that the communists are mobilizing. So how do they address that? Right? And I've tried to demonstrate through the history of the 1920s and 30s and 40s that the tensions that were there between them. Right? So let me stop here. Let me pause and see if you have any questions. Thank you so much for listening to this. So I'm stopping share now.
Junaid, I think that was something very thoroughly researched topic, in a sense of understanding the history of communism and locating the different kinds of communism, and even the language used by the two, I would say, contending camps, like the Brahmins and non-Brahmins, and how the communism was located by Dange and the other non-Brahmin leaders of the time. I think that's very interesting idea. You in your book, you talked about the urban spaces like the Bombay Improvement Trust and the Bakchal and whatnot. So these locations are very important from the Dalit historical point of view, because from where Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar lived in those settings, he saw the workers' movement firsthand. He was, in fact, we can say, one of the labor leaders, had participated.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Isn't it? So that part of his legacy of being a labor leader is not much talked about. So how do you situate the labor movement in Bombay, particularly? In your book, you referred about the mill workers, mostly coming from Konkan area and all those parts of Maharashtra, and particularly Dalits. You talked about the different locations of Chambars and Mangs in your book. So as an Ambedkarite activist, I'm very interested in knowing from you, and of course you refer to your book, as to how the urbanization and the problems of the city. And your book is titled as Outcast Bombay. So, do you think that even today there are certain localities in Bombay which you can call "quote unquote" outcast?
No, absolutely. Right. I mean, this is a history. This is the history of urbanization of Bombay. So from very early on, I mean, you have even in the 19th century, even before industries became more prominent, the localities were shaped by caste and kinship networks. Right. So even among, for instance, the some of the Muslim mercantile communities, you'll find the Mimanwada, the Bohris would live in particular localities. Even before, from the 19th century itself, right? Then once industries start and when they recruit now people for when Bombay starts expanding, one of the things that happens in Bombay is when Bombay starts expanding, one of the first things that people start talking about from the 1850s onwards, we really need a sewage system for Bombay. So the colonial government, there are plans always. But in the 1950s, then their excuse was, oh, there is this now the mutiny, and we have to now try to deal with the mutiny.
Right.
So there is we can't lay down a sewage system, particularly in localities where the Indians and particularly the Indian poor are living. Then later on in the 70s, then 60s and 70s, then they say, oh no, there is this financial crisis in the world. We can't spare that money. Which goes on until same reason until the 1880s, 1890s, etc. But if there is no sewage system, then they need people who would want to deploy people then to clean the city. And who are the people that they're recruiting? They're recruiting people then, of course, from the Dalit communities, from northern India, from southern India, from Maharashtra. And then they're also making sure that there are divisions within the community.
Yes.
So the street sweepers are different.
Yes.
And then the people who are cleaning are lifting night soil, as they call it, they're different. So that when they want to, if there is a disgruntlement among them, they can play one against the other. Right. So when you're demanding wages, and which happens actually in the 1880s itself, that there is a demand for higher wages. So what they do is that they use the sweepers, mostly who are the Marathi speaking Dalits, many of them Mahars. So they're using them against the Bhangis and Mehtars, etc. These groups. So first, there is no laying down of a sewage system, which is a government policy. They're saying we can't lay. Then you have to deploy people to clean it. Then how are they then deploying people and disciplining them? And housing becomes a way to discipline them too, because when they come to the city, they're looking for a place to live. So you give them chawls and housing in tenements, or allow them to build a hut, etc. But so that they don't protest them, right? So they remain there. They remain there. So that is one, of course, about the city itself. Then, of course, when the plague happens in the 1890s, and it's blamed on this miasma, etc., because of the city is overcrowded, ill-ventilated, etc. They start clearing up, and then they start building some chawls, and Dabak chawl is part of that, right? The Bombay Improvement Trust chawls and all. Then in that, of course, then who will get housing where? Right. So, and they looked at caste in order to give a lot housing. Right. So some of them they allotted, and those are limited chawls. Most people, of course, are living on chawls built by private landlords. Right. So, and in that, of course, some people can afford to live there, and if you're Dalit, you may not be able to afford, or are not even allowed to live in those places. So you live in different places. Right. So that is the history of some of these chawls, urban spaces that are coming up, in which caste is important. And caste is important not just among, of course, Dalits, but when the cooperative movement starts in the early 1900s, cooperative housing societies, what the British government says is, we will consider caste as an ideal principle to form cooperatives, housing societies.
Yes.
And that's where you see the cooperatives of some of the mercantile communities, the Bhatia merchants, for instance. Soon they will be the Saraswat Brahmin colonies, etc. Right? They're considering caste in allotting spaces for you, places for you for housing, which will also shape planning, because some of these people who get these spaces then say that we don't want meat stalls in our locality. We are vegetarians. So all that. So even urban planning has to consider this caste. So this is the history that I wanted to explore. And then when the 1920s comes and the Ambedkar comes on the scene, he sees that in the industries itself, textile industries, Dalits don't have access to higher paying jobs. Some of the big higher paying jobs in the textile industry are not reserved, but are really for, because it relies on caste and kinship network, it's really for certain groups. So in the 1928 strikes, he includes the point that the Dalit should also be included in some of the weaving departments, etc. All that, higher paying jobs. The mill owners say, this caste is a question between the workers. We are not looking at this. It's really a question between the workers, and they dismiss it. The mill workers dismiss it. It's a workers' problem. You are denying each other access to jobs, high paying jobs. So this is the history that of planning, urban housing planning of the city that I wanted to bring out. And then of course this tension between labor, which Ambedkar himself addresses it. So the support for the 1928 strike, which he supports, is based on this provision that Dalits will be given some higher paying jobs in certain departments of the bills. Right. That's so he writes that. Of course, that probably doesn't happen as much. I mean, doesn't happen at all, maybe, because as I'm saying, the mill owners themselves dismissed it and said, you sort it out among yourself. But Ambedkar then is very circumspect and does not support the 1929 strike, because there are two strikes. There is a 1928 strike that goes on for 6 months. And then there is the 29 strike, which again goes on for 6 months. Ambedkar doesn't support the 1929 strike because the earlier 6-month strike of 1928 has really reduced workers to a penury, and particularly Dalit workers to a penury. So he said, declaring a 6-month strike immediately after another 6-month strike is madness. So he does not support that.
Right.
But he has to address the question of labor too, right? In the 19th. So he is an important labor leader too.
I think that's a very interesting part of your book, because because I'm mostly talking about from the Ambedkarite movement perspective here, and particularly in reference to the city of Bombay, which was like the hub of the Ambedkarite movement. And I would say that, it was like the main hub from which the spokes went all over the places. Exactly. And that's where the Ambedkarite movement really began. Mobilization of the both, Bahishkruti Karni Sabha and the printing press and the newspapers and so on and so forth. So as a scholar of not only the history but also social history of a city like Bombay, where you have talked about the locations like Kamatipura and so like how do you see this intertwining between the problem of I would say the exploitation on the basis of gender, in a sense of the locations like Kamatipura and area? There are Dalit movements, and this Goldfield, of course, is one of the places.
Absolutely.
So how do you see this all intertwining of I would say different strands?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so for instance, it's also then you have to consider the history of migration into Bombay, of workers into Bombay. And most of the time, workers that are coming in Bombay are coming, there are mostly male workers, so single male workers who are coming into the city. And of course, sex is an important need of life. So, for then they are visiting red light districts and etc. for that, right? And many of the sex workers or quite a few of the sex workers, they come from different parts, but some of them are also Dalit sex workers, right? And that's why you see the emergence of Kamatipura, and that's why in Kamatipura, of course, there is a high. If you even look at even modern day census reports, I was looking at the 1981 census too. You'll see that in Kamatipura, in that area, the percentage of Dalits are very high actually, compared to other parts of the city. So there is that. Yeah. Wow. So that's how many of the sex work business, then sex work thrives there in those localities in Kamatipura. But they are also important political players, right? I mean, they have a mind and they are have of their own, right? They are watching and listening to everything. They are understanding. They have an understanding of their world. Right? They have an understanding of the Dalit movement. They have an understanding of some Marxism. They have an understanding of how Ambedkar has converted to Buddhism in the 1950s.
No, that was a very fascinating reference that, 1962,
Exactly,
you're talking about the conversion taking place in Kamadipura and the women there are embracing Buddhism. I think that's a piece of information that is so, I think, I would say, very special. It's like,
exactly,
these moments in the movement needs to be highlighted the way you have done, Junaid.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. And see, the conversion, of course, is a long process, right? I mean, conversion. I mean, one assumes in our mind that conversion is like one switch going off and another coming on.
But it's not like that.
It's not like that. It's a process. So they continue to convert in the late 50s, 60s. The conversion goes on there. So yeah, so these are some of the things I wanted to highlight.
We are reaching to the conclusion of our talk today, and I would like to ask those who are here in the Zoom meeting if they have any pressing question to Junaid. Anybody is having any pressing question to Junaid, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will end up with the comment before, and then I will request Junaid to have any concluding remarks.
Yeah, I have one question.
Arun.
Yeah. Hi, Arun. Yeah.
Yeah. So first, thank you for explaining the history of and your research towards your book and all of this. Yes. During all of this, when communism was in the consciousness during this time, the 1920s, it was usually by those, like you mentioned, Arya Samajas, or still quite religious people in India. What were the views of other revolutionaries at the time, like Bhagat Singh, for example? Did he have opposition to these type of communists that still had these strong religious views and just thought that caste will dwindle away? Because Bhagat Singh was quite progressive at the time, wasn't he?
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. He was a Marxist, right? I mean, he was reading Lenin, etc. He was a Marxist himself. He died so young, right? Bhagat Singh. So we don't really know. I mean, if he would have made some critique of some of these trends within Marxism or their inability to address the caste question, one assumes that he would have later on. But from his writing, we can't, because he died so young, right? He dies in his 20s. So we don't get much from that. I'm sure that he has an understanding. He knows that because he's from those parts in the Punjab, he is aware of the Arya Samaj and stuff, right? I mean, but I have not seen any critiques. I have not seen.
Oh, okay. Well, he did publish something under a pseudonym. I've forgotten the pseudonym. Regarding untouchability, he submitted something in the Kirti. I don't speak Hindi or Punjabi. I read a translation by another historian, Saeed Irfan Habib, in particular.
Oh, of course. Oh, wow. Oh, yeah.
He wrote a book, something about Iqlab Bhagat Singh. He mentioned a translation of and it was called The Problem of Untouchability. Bhagat Singh himself, he was against it. Whole idea of untouchability. He was trying to get the consciousness of Dalits to raise up and fight against British imperialism. But I just find it strange.
Let me make a note so that I look for it. And if you have it, I mean, please, if you can send me that citation, I'll be very grateful. Let me also.
So the author is Saeed Irfan Habib, and the book in particular where he talks about Bhagat Singh's view on untouchability is called Iqlab.
Okay, got it. Yeah, Inqilab. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, That's what I was curious. Like, someone as progressive as Bhagat Singh, and he was quite, again, like you said, he was very young.
Yeah.
I would imagine him, again, I'm extrapolating here just
Yeah.
from very limited reading of him. I could imagine him being against these type of communists.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious if you knew any.
I'm also, I mean, even because we have to extrapolate and speculate, I am sure he would have been. Yeah.
Yeah.
And but this reference is very interesting. I'll read it.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a good book. It's a book full of all of Bhagat Singh's views on religion and politics in particular. But yeah, thanks for your talk and your explanation earlier. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Junaid, before we part away, I would like to just bring out something from your book and try to look at it from a political point of view. Is that on page 104 of your book, you mentioned about the striking workers in 1949 were led by the Bombay Municipal Kamgar Sangha.
Yeah.
And Bombay Municipal Employees Union, headed by B.R. Ambedkar, who was president of India's Constituent Assembly at the time. The vice president and secretary of the union were leaders of the Dalit movement in the city, P.T. Borale and Marke Goa.
Yeah.
Because why absolutely. I think this reference is so important to highlight today, because in the 1957 election, when the Scheduled Caste Federation and Communist and the Socialist had their alliance, together they defeated the Congress party in power in the Bombay Municipal Corporation election.
Absolutely. And P.T. Borale becomes the mayor of Bombay.
And P.T. Borale becomes the mayor of Bombay city. And that's something unprecedented achieved just after 1 year of demise of Baba Ambedkar because of the mobilization of the workers in Bombay city.
And that alliance that is formed, exactly. Yeah.
And that's something very positive for even, when the Dalit movement is lost in its vitality, in the sense that, in a political vitality, in a sense that, everything looks so gloomy. The Dalit politics, looks like it's in shambles. But the example like this, P.T. Borale becoming the mayor of the Bombay Municipal Corporation, BMC, is something very, very, I would say, inspiring.
Absolutely, very interesting. Absolutely, very interesting,
isn't it? And it has this history of mobilization of workers. Of course, you are talking about the Kamgar Sangha, and today, and in India today, this all unions and all this mobilization of the workers, I would say, they don't exist anymore, because there are a lot of state strings attached to this.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So there are a lot of these hidden gems in your book, and I would like to, invite you in the future to talk more about these aspects of, how the literary movement, particularly the literary movement, emerged from the city like Bombay and all. But that would be for another discussion. Junaid, thank you so much for being today with us and having done this wonderful presentation on your book. And I really, really value your time spent tonight to talk about your book. Before we conclude, do you have any passing remarks? Anything to sum up before we say goodbye tonight?
No. I have attributed a lot of my own journey to first my understanding of my introduction first to Ambedkar. I grew up in Pune, but it's an insular childhood. You don't understand caste, etc. But it's really through Ambedkar and then through that journey that I was really inspired by to read a bit more, and to figure out certain things. So I owe a lot to Ambedkar and to the Ambedkarite movement, to people in some of the movements who have helped me in shaping my understanding. And I would encourage everybody to read, right? I mean, that's what Ambedkar had said. One of the important things that you should, in order to understand the world, is to read, of course, engage with the world itself, and then change it, think of ways of changing the world.
Yeah. No, I think there was one question which I missed. Nitin Sawant has asked this question. It's about, he has read in that time, large group of Dalits from Gujarat were called for sanitation and sweeping jobs and were given place in Dadar. Even today in Dadar East, they have big locality on Station Road.
Absolutely. Right.
So you found that
Vallapakhadi Center or something, there is there in now what is Central Bombay, etc. That's also right. The Meghwal Dalits, Meghwal Dalits. There's an important, they are an important presence, and they were again invited. They were called, or they are not invited. It's invited seems like as if there is somebody has laid out a red carpet. But they were brought to the city in order to clean. So and housing and was a way for them for the government to make them stay put in that place.
Yeah.
So that.
Junaid bhai, this is a last question from young Nitin. He is very curious. He's asking you whether you think Bhagat Singh would have joined Dr. Ambedkar after seeing how communism was infected by Brahmanism.
Right. No, absolutely. I think he would have worked at least for alliance like something like R.B. More was doing. I think he would have done that.
Right.
If Arun is saying that he was opposed to untouchability, I think he would have tried to forge an alliance. Right? Maybe not quit the communist movement, maybe, or but forge an alliance definitely.
Right.
Between the two.
So Junaid bhai, thank you so much once again. Congratulations for this very important work that you have produced. As I said in the beginning, that it's like an intellectual feat. It's not easy to take one a geographical location as a research area and look at the different movements that are emerging out of that geographical location, at the same time changing the landscape of that location. So it's a very dynamic process. And as I said, that it is a work of interdisciplinary research that you did, and I would like to again congratulate you, and I would like to say thank you so much for joining tonight, and we are looking forward to invite you again, Junaid bhai. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for sticking around and listening to the talk. I really enjoyed myself, and I hope I can meet some of you in person soon.
Very soon. Very soon.
Bye.